Okay, folks, it seems to be about time, so we'll make a start. So, hello, thank you very much for coming. My name is James Mannion, and as you can see, I do a few things. I'm currently on a mad sort of final deadline to finish my PhD in the next 6 weeks or so. So it's a bit of a luxury to come up here. I also do some work with the Institute. I did a session earlier today, which was about some work that I've been doing with a school, like action research, practitioner research. I do lots of that sort of stuff, and I do lots of other types of work with schools. So this time last year, I did a talk at Research Ed as well, and I started the talk with this image of Daniel in the lion's den. And the reason that I did that was because I was talking then about my PhD study, this 5-year evaluation of a learning to learn intervention. So it started as a year 7 thing, and then it grew over time. It became this whole school approach, and we evaluated it. And the reason that I was feeling like Daniel in the Lion's Den is because Tom Bennett once wrote a book called Teacher Proof. Some of you may have read it, and there's a chapter in there called Learning to Learn to Learn to Learn, where he says learning to learn isn't even a thing. We've been hoaxed. The hipsters are selling snake oil on this, whether they know it or not. So I'm not sure whether my meagre whiskers will qualify me as a hipster. I'm not sure about that. But either way, you know, I beg to differ with Tom on that point. Although I do have some sympathy for it. There's been some. It got kind of flaky there for a little while. The learning to learn movement, if you can call it that. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I want to start this talk with an even more audacious image, if you like, which is of the emperor parading around in an invisible cloak. So who is the emperor? Well, to some extent, it's Ben Goldacre, who you may be familiar with. He's a doctor, and back in 2013, he was commissioned to write this report through the so-called Nudge Unit. It's kind of a silly name. The Nudge Unit, Michael Gove said, like, do a report about evidence in education, and he wrote this report that basically said, you guys need to get your house in order, you know, it's all a mess, and you just need to do loads of RCTs, randomized controlled trials, like what we do in medicine, and then everything will be fine. I've got loads of respect for Ben Goldacre. I really admire his stuff. His Bad Science column was great. His stuff about bad pharma was amazing, like really brave, like standing up to the pharmaceutical industry and telling them what they should and shouldn't be doing. But, you know, in education research, he doesn't understand, and I know because I've been on a similar journey recently, he doesn't know what he doesn't know. And it's kind of ironic that somebody who wrote a book called, I'm afraid it's a little bit more complicated than that, would sort of wade into the middle of the education debate and say, you guys all just need to do RCTs, and you'll finally figure out what's going on, and, you know, we can all go home. It's a little bit more complicated than that. To some extent, the emperor is Messrs. Gove and Gibb. You know, like at Research Ed last year, Nick Gibb gave a talk where he talked. I didn't hear him today, but he talked about you know, the importance of evidence and how much he supports Research Ed. But in that same talk, he also gave his support to the Academies programme, on which the evidence is extremely mixed, and the grammar school programme, for which the evidence is basically a big screaming, "Oh God, no, not that again!" You know. So I think that to an extent, you know, the evidence-based practice is kind of a fig leaf for ideological or maybe party political concerns. Who knows? The EEF I'm going to talk about a little bit later, but obviously, so this is I'm sure you're all familiar with it, right? It was set up by Gove, handsomely funded to the tune of what, £250 million or something. It's a lot of money there. And they're basically doing two things, aren't they? They quite quickly they wrote this to the toolkit that you're probably all familiar with, this like league table of educational interventions ranked from, you know, highly productive to highly counterproductive, shall we say. And then they've also done all these randomized controlled trials, and I'll talk about that later on. It's really interesting because having just listened to Lauren's talk, I'm rethinking part of what I'm going to say there. Anyway. To an extent, the emperor is the randomized controlled trial itself, not per se, but it's used its application to education. The RCT, you've sort of got a little bit of an intellectual like crush on it. It's a beautiful thing. It's a really elegant little, you know, thing that's just designed to determine what's true and what's not. And in some circumstances, it works really well. But what I'm going to argue today is that in education, it doesn't work, even though it's used widely now. And so in a sense, the emperor is all of the above. Here are some things that I might talk about. I want to talk about my own journey a little bit to start with. What is a complex intervention? It's an idea that's very commonly understood in other fields, medicine and psychotherapy and so on, but not really used in education. To what extent are they used in education? What is complexity theory? And what does complexity theory have to tell us about education? Some problems with the EEF toolkit and the RCT program arising from these understandings, this lens of complexity, if you like. And where do we go from here? Because, and how is in the title, right? And so I'm hopefully going to not just be this nihilistic talk that's saying that everything's rubbish. So my journey into complexity was, so before I've been a teacher now for 11 years, and before that I was a scientist. I worked in, my degree was biology and psychology, and I worked in neuroscience labs in UCL and in the States, at Harvard Medical School in the States. And when I was there, I was actually, I don't do this to name drop, I was totally there on a wing and a prayer. My brother is this amazing, he's a bloody brain surgeon actually now, and he was doing all this cool stuff, and he basically just got me a job in the lab, right? And so that's how come I got there. They did end up sort of offering me a PhD, which would have been split between those two places, and I just knew that, A, I didn't understand what the hell was going on. It's really complicated. It was like the neuroscience of pain. And B, I'd seen enough people going through that process to just think that just does not look like fun. And not just the actual getting of the PhD doesn't look fun, but what comes after that, it just looks like really hard work and really confusing. So I didn't do that. So I thought I'd just come home, and this Harvard professor was saying, well, what are you going to do when you go home? And I was like, I don't know, I was doing music and poetry and stuff at the time, and still do that a bit. And I was like, I'm going to be an artist, just go back and be an artist. He's like, right, okay, well, if you ever need any money, then, look up this person. There's this person that I'm in touch with, and they're based in Brighton, and I've worked with them sometimes. I was like, oh, well, what do they do? And he was like, I don't really know. They sort of turn up at conferences, and they email me a lot, and I don't know, just go and talk to them. So I did, and I came back and went and worked in this murky underworld, which is called medical marketing. Lots of people don't even know that this thing exists. So medical marketing agencies are like hired by pharmaceutical companies to help them sell their drugs, essentially. But because their advertising is quite restricted about what you can and can't do, with drugs advertising, you can't make bold claims and so on. They have these publication programs. So that you would have like monkeys at typewriters like me who would sit there and write proper copy for scientific journals that go into things like the BMJ and the Lancet and so on, like high-end journals. And they was just writing up randomized controlled trials comparing their drug to drug B, and lo and behold, drug A comes out. And it's actually quite horrifying when you look at these articles, when they were training us, and they were saying, look at this BMJ article, there's all these marketing messages that are sort of hidden in there. It was a really weird world. But so I wrote about RCTs for about 2 years. And not only did I write about them in a straight way, but I used to go to these advisory board meetings where a bunch of doctors would sit around and pull apart that pharmaceutical company's RCT program, and sometimes it wouldn't go back together again, and then the drug company would ignore everything that they'd said and just carry on with what they were doing, but they said, we've consulted the medics, And so I came to understand a thing or two. I'm no expert, but I understood a thing or two about RCTs and what they can and can't do. And I'll come on to that in a while, but the other thing that I became familiar with was this idea of a complex intervention, which is a widely understood term in the medical literature. So a complex intervention is defined as essentially an intervention with a number of interacting components. It takes account of the number and difficulty of behaviours of those delivering and or receiving the intervention. A number of different groups or organisational levels may be targeted. It generates lots of different kinds of outcomes, and there's a degree of flexibility of tailoring the intervention to respond to contextual nuance. So this is not like an off-the-shelf thing. It's a sort of dynamic system, right? And there's this study. I apologise, I tried to find the citation, I've got it at home, but there's a study of someone who was looking at the effectiveness of different local education authorities, and they identified 5 factors. They were like, these are the 5 features of an effective, good local education authority. And when you look at those 5 factors individually, they stack up to about 35% of the variance. And when you look at them in combination, they account for 50% of the variance. So like, you guess the question, to what extent can you look at any one thing in isolation and for that thing to be actually true? It's only telling you a part of the story. And it might be that it's only in a statistical sense that you can look at one thing in isolation. You just exclude other things, some of which you don't even know about. And it's essentially this idea of marginal gains, this idea that the small gains that might accrue from any individual area of practice, when combined, will stack up and interact and lead to a greater effect size overall. That's the theory. And so there's this is a really interesting thing for the Medical Research Council. Complex interventions are widely used in the health service, public health, and in areas of social policy such as education. That's really interesting. It's true that within the medical world, complex interventions are used. They feature in the literature on medical education, but in the wider education field, as we'll see, there's barely anything there. I won't read out that whole thing, but it just talks about some of the methodological difficulties that evaluating complex interventions brings up. And it ends by talking about the complexity of the causal chains linking intervention with outcome. In the last talk that Lauren just talked about, we were talking about like doing experimental studies and trying to determine the cause. It's like this input-output thing. But when you've got this complex dynamic system where you've got feedback loops, positive and negative feedback loops, and all this crazy stuff happening, you can't determine like that X causes Y, because it's not how it works. It's just like you're just taking a tiny little snapshot of one moment of a really complicated thing that you can't see, basically. You can't see all of it anyway. So to give you an example of what this looks like in medicine, there's a really classic example. As I said, the stuff that I was working in was about pain, neuroscience of pain. So it starts with a recognition that pain is really complicated. The extent to which somebody feels pain is a subjective experience. It involves sensory stuff, emotional stuff, behavioural stuff, and it's influenced by lots of different factors: your personality, your gender, any pre-existing pain syndromes, your genetic makeup, what kind of surgery you just had, and so on. And also specific things, whether you're depressed, if you're fearful, if you're anxious about stuff, whether, how good you are at coping, and all that stuff. And so like a standard thing is just like monotherapy. If somebody comes out of an operation, they just give them morphine. It's cheap and it works to an extent. But it's very limited, and you get really horrible side effects with high doses. So multimodal analgesia is this idea. Some nods at the back of the room, nodding from experience.
Yeah.
Yes. So multimodal analgesia uses a combination of analgesics and techniques that act on multiple pain pathways. So if you have an operation in your leg, then you're using, local anesthetics here, and then there's also stuff that goes on in the spine, like the spine regulates how pain works. Then you've got stuff that's going on in the brain, and you can give them a massage, and there's all kinds of different techniques that. So just to give you an example of a paper, this is from just 2013. This is in the European Spine Journal. So major spine surgery is followed by a large amount of opioid consumption, significant pain, difficult mobilization, all these problems. So they gave, it wasn't a controlled trial, but it was a comparative study. There was some of the pre-intervention group, different patients. And so they gave them acetaminophen, some non-steroidals, gabapentin, ketamine. They just threw the kitchen sink at it. They gave them loads of stuff. And then they compared them afterwards, and they found that they used less opioids on days 1 and 2. They were mobilized earlier from bed, so the bed's freed up, so there's economic benefits. Ambulation was earlier, both with and without a walking frame, and they had far fewer side effects. And it costs less as well, for a whole bunch of reasons. So, as I say, this idea is really, really widespread in the medical literature. And so when I later I realised that this pharmaceutical job was just awful, and I quit one day and cycled to Morocco, and then decided I needed to become a teacher. So I came back and did that. And then after a few years, I'd done a master's, and I was working in this school down in Brighton, and this email came around, and they said, we're going to do a Year 7 thinking curriculum, as it was called at first. We want people to apply to be a part of this team, and so I applied, and I was appointed to. There was a competitive selection process, which was important. because often things like this are given to people who've just got a bit of time on their timetable, and it doesn't work when you do that. There's no point in doing it. So we were all really committed, and we talked, like, in Learning to Learn, the literature goes back to like the 1970s, and there's always been this debate about whether or not you can teach learning skills, behaviours, attributes, habits, or whatever, whether you can teach them separately, or whether really this stuff should be sort of embedded across the piece in everything that we do. And some people say, well, it should be embedded because transfer doesn't happen, so it should be embedded. But the problem with an embedded model is that not everybody does it, not everybody finds time for it, not everybody believes in it, and it doesn't work. And so we thought, well, we just need to do both, right? It's not an either-or situation. So we explicitly have, so we were given 5 lessons a week just in year 7, which was amazing. I know, raised eyebrows. Just in year 7, and then when they got to the end of year 7, the curriculum time expanded into year 8 and then again into year 9. So over 3 years, the first cohort had more than 400 lessons of learning to learn. What we did with them changed from one year to the next. And it was also, as time went on, it became a kind of a whole school approach to teaching and learning, where CPD was joined up, tutor time was about this, the reward system was all sort of pulling in the same direction. And we decided against buying in some previous, there's loads of learning to learn programs that sort of people have developed already, but you really need to own something. If you want it to work, you need to sort of just have come up with it yourself, in essentially. You think about what other people have done, but there needs to be a degree of autonomy, I think, in order for something to work. And so, reasoning from first principles, I thought back to this medical experience, and I was like, well, we'll treat this as a complex intervention. We're not just going to do one thing. We'll pull together loads of different areas of evidence-informed practice, for which there's some evidence in the literature that it makes a positive difference. And hopefully these things will interact and stack up and do that thing where you get a big effect size overall. So this is a table that basically summarises the main things. Essentially, I think it really boils, if I had to say it in a sentence, it boils down to 3 things, what we did. Self-regulation, so trying to find ways to get kids to take some sort of ownership over their learning. Metacognition, finding as many ways as we could to help them to reflect on learning. You know, that famous John Dewey statement about how you don't learn by doing, you learn by reflecting on what has been done. And oracy is just so important. If I had to hang my hat on one thing for the rest of my career, it would be oracy. Getting kids to learn how to speak and listen effectively in a whole range of contexts. But we did all this other stuff as well. Thinking and reasoning skills was amazing. There's this amazing course called Thinking and Reasoning Skills. It's an OCR course, and it's being discontinued. But if you go on their website, the resources are just amazing. It's the best stuff that I've ever seen done as to how to teach kids critical thinking and reasoning skills. I just super recommend that. And we've had a really explicit approach to transfer, because, as I mentioned before, transfer doesn't happen. Stuff like that you develop in this classroom over here, they go down there and it's a different classroom, and the skills don't transfer. And we had to have a really joined up approach. We had a whole school shared language of learning that we talked about. We did loads of work to make sure that there was this joined up diet of learning, if you like. So we're using the same language to describe learning across the piece. So in terms of outcomes, this is a paper that I published last year with my supervisor, and there's another one coming out next year. So after 1 year, there was significant gains in CAT scores. We were comparing them to the previous year group, who were very comparable at entry to the school. Far fewer behaviour points and so on. So it was just like encouraging at first. This paper talks about the end of year 9 outcomes. By the end of year 9, there was really significantly improved attainment compared with that previous year group. And there was this closing of the pupil premium gap from the bottom up, which I'll show you here. So this was like overall attainment, all subjects combined at the end of year 9. This was the pre-learning to learn cohort. This was the learning to learners. And you can see that, so this was the whole year group. So non-pupil premium kids seemed to benefit from this as well, but the gains were especially pronounced among kids who were eligible for the pupil premium. And to break that down a little bit more, just very briefly, this is like subject by subject. So the grey bars is what the pupil premium gap was in the pre-learning to learn cohort, and the white bars are the learning to learn cohort. So at the end of year 9 in English, for example, in the pre-learning to learn cohort, the pupil premium gap was like 30+%, which is sort of high but fairly typical. And by the end of 3 years, the learning to learners, in fact, the gap had closed so far that it had gone the other way, with pupil premium kids outperforming non-pupil premium in a handful of subjects, which is what you'd sort of expect if disadvantage was not a predictor of educational attainment. And if you combine all the things together, then look at those bars on the right-hand side. So the average gap in the pre-learning to learn cohort was 25%, and in the learning to learners it was just 2% after 3 years. And then we followed them through to GCSE, and this is the paper that's coming out. Long story short, that first year group went on to get the best set of results that school had ever seen by some margin, and there was by far the biggest reduction in pupil premium gap of any school in the city in a year where the gap increased across the city as a whole. And we did a whole range of qualitative measures as well, which I'm not going to go into, but it wasn't just this, we weren't only looking at those outcomes. So I became sort of persuaded that this idea of a complex intervention could be of benefit to education. Excuse me. So if you search complex intervention or multimodal intervention, the medical literature, you get it's not huge, but over 1,000 hits. And if you look at those, they are using that in the way that we talked about earlier, this idea of multimodal interventions made of different parts. And if you search ERIC, the education search engine, you get 129 hits, which seems like a lot. Interesting, as I said before, lots of the medical hits talk about medical or health education, but when you actually drill down into those 129 papers, actually lots of the stuff on ERIC is sort of from medical journals. So these red bars is just like clinical studies or like things to do with medical research, evaluation and methods and so on. By far the biggest use of it in the use of this language in the education literature is to do with special needs and literacy, but they talk about multimodal to really mean like multi-sensory inputs that they're doing to help kids to sort of learn in triangulated ways, say. Lots of examples where multimodal is mean to use multiple modalities. Some of these are like theoretical papers, so they're just saying, oh, isn't everything complex? We should do stuff that's a bit more complex, but there's nothing actually being evaluated there. So basically, there's nothing in the education literature. This language is absent in the education literature, and what I'm hoping will be the case is that will be an original contribution of my PhD thesis. Will be that I'm not saying that this is the first ever complex intervention that's been done, but I think it's potentially the first time that it's been really clearly defined as such. The most explicit use was this paper by Anne Brown, who's there at every turn. When I got into learning to learn, Anne Brown did loads of stuff like that. And then I went back to the start, metacognition. She was doing metacognition research in the 70s. Then I got into complex interventions. There she is again. She wrote this piece called Design Experiments, Theoretical and Methodological Challenges in Creating Complex Interventions in Classroom Settings. So what she's talking about, because she was a psychologist who was doing stuff just like very small studies with kids in artificial settings, in lab type studies, for example. And then she realized that this was just not really very valid or helpful, and so she started talking about classroom-based research as complex, right? She also talks about reading complex texts. But essentially, this is saying that we need new and complex methodologies to capture the systemic nature of learning, teaching, and assessment. So it was, again, it was just essentially a plea to say we need to start taking account of the complexity of these systems that we're studying. But there's nothing really else that's happened since then. So complexity, there's a number of ways. Like my layperson's understanding of it is that there's metaphysical complexity. There's this amazing quote in this book by Searle. I wonder if I've got time. By John Searle, who talks about metaphysical complexity. He says, to give you a feeling for the complexity of the problem, I want to begin by considering the metaphysics of an ordinary social relation. Consider a simple scene like the following. I go to a cafe in Paris and sit in a chair at a table. The waiter comes and I utter a fragment of a French sentence. The waiter brings the beer and I drink it. I leave some money on the table and I leave. An innocent scene. But its metaphysical complexity is truly staggering, and its complexity would have taken Kant's breath away if he'd ever bothered to think about such things. And then there's a footnote that says Kant did not bother to think about such things because in his era, philosophers were obsessed with knowledge. It seems to have come back around to that. Notice that we cannot capture the features of the description I have just given in the language of physics and chemistry. There's no physical chemical description adequate to define restaurant, waiter, sentence of French, money, chair, table, even though all restaurants are physical and so on, are physical phenomena. Notice furthermore that the scene has a huge invisible ontology. The waiter did not own the beer that he gave me, but he's employed by the restaurant which own it. It goes on and on and on. And he basically ends by saying, if after leaving the restaurant I then go to listen to a lecture or attend a party, the size of the metaphysical burden I am carrying only increases, and one sometimes wonders how anyone can bear it. Pretty amazing that, isn't it? So there's all this, so just like on a conceptual level, like things are dizzyingly complex, right, and layered. Then there's multiform, you know, like that thing that Donald Rumsfeld said about there being known knowns and known unknowns, and everyone sort of takes the piss out of him for a bit. But I think it's like really the smartest thing that I ever heard him say. It's really true. It's just like in terms of a classroom, like how many factors are affecting even just any one kid. You know, have they had their breakfast that morning? Do they share a bedroom with somebody? Have they got a bedroom? Are they feeling safe? Are they, you know, just obsessed with the girlfriend or boyfriend that they've just acquired, and they just can't stop thinking about it? Like, how many ththings are there that we don't know? Just in that category of like known unknowns and then unknown unknowns. We don't know what we don't know, and it's the number of factors that are in play in any given classroom or school system is staggering. And then you've got all this methodological complexity that Anne Brown was talking about in her piece. So complexity theory is a lens through which we can start to get a handle on these levels of complexity. It's related to chaos theory. So chaos theory is the study of deterministic systems that behave in unpredictable ways, like the famous sort of butterfly effect, right? The butterfly flaps its wings and you can have a hurricane 100 miles away. Complexity theory is a study of non-deterministic dynamic networks that contain a number of different constituent parts that interact and adapt to each other over time. And there's this really key concept here, this idea of emergence. You get emergent properties. When you have a system that's complex enough, other stuff starts to happen in layers above it. A classic example being, you know, like a termite mound that looks like there's this higher intelligence, but no individual ant or termite knows what the hell's going on, but it has this emergent property of superstructured organization. And consciousness is, you know, how the hell does consciousness emerge from the interaction of cells in the brain? It's very, very mystifying stuff. And so there's this idea of a complex adaptive system. And if you just think about some of these things, I won't read them all out, but this is a system that's been defined as having a large number of elements with many interactions, which are non-linear, which have feedback loops, both positive and negative. There are also these phenomena such as lock-in. Have you heard about this idea of lock-in? A classic example that's sometimes given is the QWERTY keyboard. So the QWERTY keyboard was designed when we used to use typewriters, and it was designed to be inefficient because, like, if you spend a bit longer to reach for that key, then all the keys of the most popular letters won't get jammed. And so it was designed to be not the fastest keyboard. And then when we moved to computers, we couldn't stop using the QWERTY keyboard because, like, if you start, the people have tried it and no one buys it, no one wants it, everyone's used to QWERTY. And so we end up with these weird phenomena where things happen and we don't really know how to stop them. It's an open system which interacts with the outside. It interacts with itself as well. It needs a constant energy flow for it to operate. Money pouring in and so on. The importance of history and the fact that each element only really interacts locally, and it just sort of builds up into this big superstructure. And I think that you could make a case that this definition of a complex adaptive system, you can define a child as a complex adaptive system, a group of children, a classroom, a department, a school, a year group, all the way up to, you know, like the world, right? There's like a doll's house. There's all these layers of complexity. So what? So everything's complex. That's the big question. So what? So when it comes, there's this talk that I watched. There's this professor from Hong Kong where he says when it comes to educational change, what the complexity theory tells us is that we need to be trying to intervene at every possible level. But looking at one thing in isolation isn't going to help us. We need to talk about this idea he calls it integrated service delivery, which is a horrible businessy type term. But like all these phrases like levers of change and silver bullet, it's not going to help you. It's because of the nature of this complexity. We need to be much more expansive in our thinking. So, what's all of this got to do with the EEF? So, as I mentioned, the toolkit has a number of problems. One being that the learning is measured in months, and that's weird, isn't it? Like to measure learning in months. I've never got my head around that. Did we talk about that before? I think we might. I can't remember. We might have done. But time is linear, right? It's a linear metaphor. So it's based on this idea that learning is linear. But we sort of know as teachers that learning isn't linear, is it? It's complicated. And somebody used the metaphor of it being like the tide coming in, right? So the tide's coming in, and like a wave comes to here, and then the next wave comes a bit further up, and the next wave comes behind, and it's this forward and backward thing. And you know that overall that the tide is coming in, but there's this sort of forward and backward ebb and flow to the way that learning works. It's based on this idea of causal linear input-output model. If you do feedback, then it will lead to 8 months of additional progress. That's literally what those findings say. Gert Biester talked about this recently. He said that this model is more akin to pig farming than the complex interventions of endeavour of education. The fact that it ranks things in a league table that are not comparable, the studies behind the toolkit are like, you're not comparing like with like. It just missing, the human being is missing from the EEF toolkit. It's just this like list, education is just a list of interventions, of concepts and interventions, and if you just only pick the right recipe, then everything will be fine. But behind all of those studies, there were people who really believed what they were doing and who made those things work, or who didn't make them work, whatever, right? And the importance of implementation and the art, the incredibly difficult art of how to implement stuff is missing as well. And I think that promoting such a simplistic model for educational change is complicated, and that is seen, so if you look at the very top thing in the EEF toolkit, it says that feedback is the most effective thing, gives you high impact for low cost. But there's a number of problems with that, one being that sometimes senior leaders will see that finding and they'll go, right everyone, we just need to do more feedback than we've ever done before, some nodding heads, and we need to mark every piece of work to within an inch of its life, and then we'll mark the responses that they give to that, and that happens. It's triple marking is the thing, and it really shouldn't be. But even more concerning than triple marking is this. So if you look at this is a study from 20 years ago, Kluger and Denisi. They looked at 607 different feedback-based interventions that have been done in schools, and they just plotted the effect sizes that they found. And like most things, it forms a bell curve. And I don't know if you can see this from the back, but this blue line is 0. So everything that's behind this had 0 impact. All the interventions to the right of the blue line had a positive impact, and some of them had this tremendous impact up here. But in almost 40% of these cases, doing this thing that the EEF tells us is the most effective thing that you can do, just like, do something about feedback, in 40% of these cases, they were making things worse than if they'd have just done business as usual. And that's really important. And that distribution, the fact that the average is to the right of the 0 line makes it true to say, on average, feedback-based interventions are effective. But if you're a school leader who's saying, I read this thing and we're all going to do it, there is about a 40% chance that we might be making things worse. That's basically what people are doing when they're changing school policy on the basis of the toolkit. There's a big chance that they're making things worse, and they're not even aware of it. So there was a piece in Impact magazine. I think I'm running a little bit low on time. There's this piece in Impact magazine earlier this year where Kevin Collins, Sir Kevin Collins, CEO of the EEF, basically said that that RCTs are brilliant because we can't determine causal relationships between teaching strategies and pupil progress. This is where RCTs come in. And so I just want to pick that apart a little bit in the last few minutes. When I was this medical writer, we didn't talk about an RCT. We talked about an RDBPCT, right? So randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, and that's what the gold standard is in medicine. So if you, in case you don't know, a single blind is when the patient doesn't know what treatment they're receiving. And a double blind is when the medics don't know either, so the drugs are coded so that they can't influence it with their behaviour, right? Or their expectations. And placebo-controlled, I'm sure you're familiar with this, you know, just they give them a sugar pill because sometimes the very act of taking a pill might make you think that you're better. These features help overcome lots of different effects. So the placebo effect, the Hawthorne effect, where being studied improves your performance because you're being evaluated. Pygmalion effect of high expectations. The John Henry effect, that's an interesting one, which is where the opposite of the Hawthorne effect, where there's control group. At the moment, the EEF, the schools sign up to the EEF and they go, right, you're in the treatment group and you're in the control group. And the control group is, what's the point of it to control group? Is to be crap, isn't it? And then those people dig in, they go, right, we'll bloody show them. We're going to double down with these year 7s this year. And that happens. I know of a number of trials where that's happened. The novelty effect, the experimental effect, and the fact is that we don't know in educational context, we can't even begin to get a handle on the extent to which these effects are in play, because they're hidden. You can't really know that. It's a double-blind education trial. The teachers would literally have to not know what they were doing. Yeah, exactly. And to placebo-control an education trial, you'd have to have the control school is just doing busy work that you were 100% sure would have zero impact. You know, we were talking about ethics in the last study. That would be a difficult thing to get through an ethics committee. The control arm as well is a problem. Like the 25 control schools, they're not all doing the same thing. They're not a homogeneous group. Randomization can be problematic as well. I won't go into this, but there are lots of examples where studies have been randomized. The EF Philosophy for Children trial, by pure dumb luck, they had the experimental group had far lower prior attainment than the control group. So then their scores went up, and they went, oh, it was due to P4C. I love P4C, and I would love for that to be true, but I have no faith in that finding at all. And there are a bunch of other methodological concerns with EF trials, which I'll send you the slides if you want. Send me an email. In short, they're based on a set of faulty assumptions, RCTs, when applied to education. They assume that learning is linear. It's not. They assume that it responds to this input-output model. It's a lot more complicated than that. They assume that the schools are stable and that they behave in predictable ways. They're not. They assume that even if you get a positive result, that you can determine causality from that and say that you can't, if you look at it, you can't determine that X caused Y. They assume that you can isolate a single factor within a complex system. You can't. You can only, at best, you can just ignore the other stuff. And you can assume, they assume that implementation, that so-called fidelity, that the actual intervention is implemented in the same way across the piece. And they can't. Right, very finally, I've got 40 seconds. We'll end on this. So I think that we can learn from medicine, not in the sense of RCTs, but in the sense with regard to recognizing the nature of complexity. I think that the school leaders' implementation science is the way forward. I'm convinced of that. Maybe talk about that next year. I think that in-school evaluation, if you're just doing something that was proven to be effective in an RCT, is no guarantee that it's working for you. We need to become rigorous evaluators of impact within our own schools. And in terms of education research, it is possible to do randomized controlled trials of complex interventions. The medics are working on this and they're making some strides in that direction. But just looking at single things in isolation, I honestly think it's just a bit of a madness. And I think that we need to use a wide spectrum of research approaches. In that lab that I used to work in at Harvard, we used to have this meeting every week with like this multidisciplinary team of like loads of different people looking at all different stuff. Lots of it didn't seem relevant, but we all had our eye on the big picture and the world that was surrounding us, and everyone learns much more effectively in that world. And lastly, we need to develop a way to describe complexity that doesn't make people glaze over. It doesn't have to be that complicated. Thank you very much. Sorry we didn't have time for questions. I would have very much liked to. Please stick around and ask away if you want. Thanks. Right, I'll sort you out. Thanks.